So I certainly have many questions I'd love to ask of the panel, but I know we're short on time, so I'm going to turn it right over to the audience because I'm sure people want to hear more. So, right here. Do we have...
Professor, you partially mentioned or answered my question with that last quotation, but I would ask you, did Jesus Christ in the New Testament ever talk to anything regarding environmentalism or environmental protection? And I would also note that the Ten Commandments have absolutely no reference to the subject. And in the light of all that, has the Judeo-Christian tradition been part of the problem through the centuries?
When you say professor, there are three professors up here.
I refer to your last remarks, where you quoted the Old Testament.
Yeah. Well, of course, you've asked the $64,000 question. And I need to alert you that politicians answer questions by saying, I didn't do it, and I won't do it again. College professors and college presidents answer questions by saying, I don't know, but let me elaborate. Let me start with the back end of your question, because I think that's the overpowering implication of your question, and that is, has the Judeo-Christian religion done more harm to the environment over the centuries than it has helped? And certainly, in the pre-modern era, I would say you're right, that the chapter in Genesis that talks about man being given dominion over the earth and its creatures has been the prevailing rationale, and certainly was during the periods of colonization and imperialism throughout the globe, for subjugating peoples and exploiting environments. And the Bible, like virtually every good book, is a festival of contradictions. However much we may think it speaks with a single voice and provides a single message, you can find in the Bible utterly contradictory statements. As for Jesus, yes, there are a few passages where he talks about the blessedness of the birds and the creatures, and by implication, the environment. But you're also right that the Bible does not spend nearly as much time talking about the spiritual significance of nature as we feel today. And that's why I said early on that in some respects, the ecological perspective requires reading between the lines rather than just being satisfied with what is explicitly said. And I think that's also true about the Bible. And Mary Evelyn can certainly talk about some of the more contemporary efforts of organized religious groups to speak to the environmental issue. But in many respects, they are speaking between the lines than having a massive amount of biblical rhetoric behind their effort, especially New Testament rhetoric. Yeah, why don't you speak to that as well?
Of course, this is an important question, and Lynn White, the historian of technology in 1967, wrote one of the most influential articles on this topic that was published in Science. And you can go look at it, and that created an industry of response. So we have a long, several decades response to this question, which is very robust and very important. And that's exactly why I said the conferences at Harvard were designed to retrieve, reevaluate, and reconstruct, which is what, as a historian of world religions, what traditions have done for 2,000 years, in the case of Christianity, 5,000 years, in the case of Confucianism and Taoism and so on. These traditions have changed radically over time, and we see that. And so we're in one of the most important creative transition moments for these traditions to respond to the largest crisis humans have had to face in 150,000 years of being Homo sapiens sapiens. And I think one of the most robust in this 10 volumes, and there were 200 people there at Harvard looking at these traditions. In the last 20 years, and we've just done a huge bibliography for Oxford of the last 10 years, 150 publications on the implications of religion, of Christianity, and some of the other world religions, but the largest number of books and articles are about Christianity. I'll just give you two very brief examples. Okay, so I'm talking in Texas about 10 years ago to a group of largely oil people. And they said to me that it was time of drilling was being considered up in the Arctic region. And they said to me, well, what do you think about drilling in the Arctic region? And I said, in fear and trembling, to be honest, but I said, you know, to drill in a region of that kind of pristine beauty and magnificence would be like tearing out some pages from the Bible. And they clapped. They got it. This is part of what we have to figure out. What are the metaphors? And let me just say one last thing, because I come from a Christian tradition. I value it enormously. I see its problems with women and many other issues. I see its promise. But here's the bottom line. If we take the book of John's Gospel, and if we say that book begins with, in the beginning was the Logos. Now the Logos is the inner ordering principle of all reality. It is that which has created life. It's that which animates life. It's that which has given us a universe that's complexified over time. So if that notion of the inner ordering principle of reality, which in a Christian form is identified with a Christ figure as a unique expression of that, what are we doing to destroy the inner ordering principle of reality? I think this is a huge question. In other words, incarnation is throughout the whole system. That's what's so special about life.
Thank you. Are there more questions? Is everyone just in awe of this panel? Well, here's one. Or
the discussion about conservation seems to be more and more of a political discussion, and more of the decisions are made in the political realm. And in the South in particular, there's a hesitancy in the church engaging in a lot of political discussions. Do y'all have some examples of how churches or really just a body of mostly Christians can really engage in those political discussions without it being a political statement?
Mary Evelyn, do you want to?
Well, there are some great examples, and Interfaith Power and Light is one that I mentioned, and it's inviting churches and synagogues to do their carbon footprint, to change their light bulbs, to respond to climate change as a moral issue, and to say, to David's point, how do we live more simply? So that is across this country now. But there's also in Seattle, Earth Ministry that's almost 20 years old, and it's doing cleanup of waterways. It's helping inner city communities with food systems. And many of the examples that have been noted here are also being worked out by religious communities. I realize, and there's a great project in Chicago called Faith in Place that's doing stunning work. And you can look up on our website, there's engaged projects for all the world's religions about what they're actually doing. But I don't want to just say this is simple. It is not simple. And it may be, apart from the money in finance and campaigns, it may be one of the most difficult topics of how we actually integrate this in a way that doesn't exacerbate problems. But it's why if we get to something that is very common in the human, which both of my colleagues have illustrated magnificently, I think we can, it may be, I'm not saying it is, but it may be one of these elements that can join us together as humans to say, if what we do as humans we are trustees for our communities. That's what's so fantastic about Charleston. You are trustees for the schools, for the arts, for these museums, for even the political system in its unraveling. But we are trustees for the Lowcountry and for the planet. And that sensibility, that generosity of spirit, I think we can bring forward. It's a language issue, and it's a huge challenge, but there are examples, and I think we can do it with respect and care, our trusteeship.
If I can just say that while that is absolutely true, I think implicit in your question is a stern reality.
Yep.
And that is when we look at the various sectors of American life, political, economic, corporate, higher education, the organized religion sector is still underrepresented in the environmental movement. Why that is a very complicated explanation that would take far longer than your patience would allow. But one of the positive reasons that is the case is that so many churches view their outreach not so much about conservation or the environment or wilderness, but rather in the form of socioeconomic justice issues in their community, in their neighborhood.
Do we have, I think we could have one more. We're all probably hungry. Was there one over there, or we can go over here, sorry.
This would be for Mr. Ransford, I suppose, but all of you might want to comment. As a landscape architect, I look for symbols of places that really help to bring out people's emotions and thoughts about the environment, to solidify their reaction. And recently we've had a lot of trouble dealing with the angel oak out at Johns Island. And I wonder if we can reflect for a moment about what this means about how we approach on a very local level the planting issues. Is it enough to have a few acres set aside around the tree? Or does this mean something more? Does this mean something about place that has a lesson for us? Thank you.
I think that's a perfect question for John, who once told me that after Hurricane Hugo, his first stop was to see Angel Oak and how it had fared. I think, if I got that story right.
Yeah, you're right.
You know, just before I respond to the Angel Oak question, you know, it was interesting that Wangari Maathai was so hesitant to speak to this issue of religion. I'm just talking from her books. I didn't know her personally. And yet her inspiration was growing up as a Kikuyu with this fig tree and what came to her through her family. But she was very explicit in saying she would not have been successful in her tree planting campaign and the social ethics that motivated this kind of environmentalism if she had not been able to speak to people in terms of the Christian tradition, which had come to dominate the life of the Kikuyu and the people in East Africa. So, you know, it's important, it's not just a theoretical issue we're talking about. Here's a person who had a deep, pragmatic, and spiritually motivated concern who was able to convey it to other Kenyans in the language that they thought, that she thought they understood best. As far as the angel oak is concerned, I've been fascinated by that tree from the time I came to Charleston. When I first came to Charleston, there was no fence around it. There were lots of young trees and other oaks growing up between it. You could climb up and down the tree. I remember the controversies that came up in terms of, you know, protect the angel oak, protect private property, when issues were raised about how it was being looked after. Every year I took governor school students there as I took them up to Francis Beidler. Many of them were actively involved in the defense of the angel oak. And there's a long history of people being concerned about that tree. And acting upon that concern, so to speak. And I think for the reasons that I'm talking about, they cannot imagine that we're not doing everything we can to sustain the life of this magnificent tree. Every semester I say to my students, how many of you have been to the Angel Oak? And, and maybe a third of them would put up their hand and say, well, you owe it to yourself, if you don't do anything else in Charleston, to go and visit this tree, because it's the most magnificent thing I've ever seen, and I've been looking at trees a long time. I wonder sometimes if we don't celebrate it enough, if we don't make enough of it, we don't give it the attention that it deserves, the due that it deserves. This would be my concern, that we don't celebrate it enough. We don't give people an opportunity to really appreciate its magnificence, and in so doing, enlist their support in protecting it.
Professor Rashford is like an elder in the community.
And Mary Evelyn, did you? Sure.
So just very quickly, yesterday a question came up about Europe and values, and especially in the Nordic countries. And I asked the Bishop of Sweden about this the other day because it's always fascinated me. And he said, look, the Christian values across these countries are dormant, but active, especially in environmental issues, you see. And it was a very interesting and longer answer. But I just want to say, the other part of this, certainly with Muir and so many of our great environmentalists, they have had this broad religious-spiritual sensibility about the environment. And that's what we're talking about reactivating. The political problem is unavoidable, but I do want to give one example of the messenger also matters. The evangelicals in this country got activated for climate change in a very interesting way with Cal DeWitt, a evangelical but science professor at University of Wisconsin, took about 40 of our evangelical leaders to the UK in 2002 and had Sir John Houghton and Sir Gillian Prance, who are world-class scientists and part of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they told these leaders, climate change is real, we can't avoid it, we have to do something about it, and that's when Richard Cizik and a whole range of them came back and got extremely activated about climate and so on. So the messenger will matter, and that's part of what we have to figure out strategically. I'm sure you'll do that in your community, and again, thank you so much for what you're doing here.
I think we ought to wrap up in the interest of time and hunger, probably, but thank you all. This was such a wonderful discussion and a great opportunity to step back and really reflect on these fundamental aspects of why we're all here and why we care. So thank you again.
Thank you, Ceara.